Anybody been to Kansas? Oh, I'm so sorry. I hope your recovery was quick. We're going to talk about shelters today. Excuse me. A lot of people think that shelters are just relative to Tornado Alley. We're going to show you that that's not really the case. AIA approved. Anybody want to sit and read this for the umpteenth time? You've seen it millions of times. Basically what we're going to talk about is my experience, Sean and I's experience over the past 26 years. We do peer reviews, so we get to see a lot of what other people are doing, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, and we're going to talk about that. What we're going to talk about is really highlights, though. If you wanted me to teach you how to do tornado shelters, I'd need at least probably a day and a half to 2 days of your time. So I got an hour and a half, so we're hitting highlights. Beware of that. We're going to talk about perspectives, revisions to the building code. 2015 is a big change for the tornado shelters. What you might expect of a properly designed shelter. And in the end, some design information from what the 361 and the ICC 500, which is a code standard. Everybody aware of the ICC 500? It is a code standard for hurricane and tornado shelters. It is a part of the code in the 2015. It was also put in as part of the 2009. We'll see that here in a minute. But it's a code. It doesn't tell you how to do it. It tells you what the results should be. So don't expect to go to either one of those documents looking to say, okay, I got to design a shelter. How do I do it? It's not going to help you. FEMA 361 has a little more commentary in it. They are really tied together in their format. The FEMA 361 is a guide only. If you do shelters that are FEMA funded, which FEMA will fund shelters if there's been a presidential declaration of a disaster where your shelter is going to be. Doesn't happen very often, but you have to follow that guide. But they are so close. There's only a few differences, and generally speaking, they're more relative to hurricanes, the differences. So very close together. Somebody asked me one time, why tornado shelters? Why are you so passionate about tornado shelters? I think that may be my phone. No, it's not. I come across this picture and I think it says it all for me. I don't know this little girl. I don't know her name. Don't know where she lives. I don't know her parents. I don't know what school that little girl goes to. I don't know what her parents do for a living, how much money they make. Don't know what church they go to or what religion they practice. Don't know what their political affiliation is, nor do I know their heritage. And none of that matters to me. What matters to me is that little girl and her mom and dad, well, hell, even Marley there, are walking away from a devastating EF5 tornado with their lives. That's what's important to me. That's my passion for shelters. These numbers, another reason I'm passionate. Those numbers are way too big. 2011 was a horrible year for the United States with tornadoes. 553 deaths, sorry. It's bad. 1,600 tornadoes, almost 1,700 tornadoes, and 6 of those were EF5s. EF5s are horrible. They're monsters. This is a big number. This number represents the number of K-12 students killed while at school in the last 8 years due to tornadoes. That number is way too big in my mind. Now, some people say, 15 in 8 years. It's not a whole lot, but how many natural disasters can you think of that could wipe out the entire population of a school entire population in less than a minute. Probably count on one hand, and tornadoes are at the top of that list. So let's talk a little bit about code revisions. A little history on the codes. IBC from 2000 to 2006 was silent. Didn't say a word. No have-tos, no nothing. In 2000, the FEMA published the 361. They realized that there's nothing out there for designers to go by. How do we design these things? So they published that in 2000, the first edition. In the 2009 and 2012 versions of the IBC, it said, if you're going to design a structure to withstand high winds, doesn't matter what you call it, I don't care what you call it, but if that's the purpose, then it shall follow the ICC 500. Didn't say you had to design one, but if you did. And that went through 9 and 12, I'm sorry. The 2015 is the big change. Still says if you design a shelter, doesn't matter who you're putting in it, doesn't matter where it's at, if, then it has to follow the ICC 500. But it's also added that there's a couple of occupancies in certain areas that have to have shelters now. Have to. Directly out of the 2015. Critical emergency operations. If you're in a 250 mile an hour wind zone, and I'll show you that here in a second, 911 call stations, EOCs, fire, rescue, ambulance, police stations, got to put a shelter in it. No ifs, you're putting a shelter in it. Unless you already have one. It was important for the code to say, yeah, if you got one, I mean, give us a little bit of credit. K-12 designers, we got K-12 designers here. Group E occupancies, again in the 250 mile an hour wind zone. If you got more than 50 occupants in there, you shall put in a tornado shelter. Shall, in accordance with the ICC 500. And that shelter has to cover everybody in the school. Everybody. Now, exceptions if it's tied to a daycare facility, it's tied to a private school, religious facility, and again, if you already have one, you don't have to do another one. So that's a big change. Big change. So the 250 mile an hour wind zone's that big blob, that red blob in the middle. Everybody says, oh, tornadoes just in Tornado Alley. Only in this little area right here. That's Tornado Alley. 22 states are affected by the 250 mile an hour wind zone. Chicago, entire state, is in the 250 mile an hour wind zone. Code applies. As most of you know, a lot of you know that K-12 guys that a couple of years ago, state of Illinois says, guess what, you build a new school, you're gonna have a shelter in it. That was a couple of years ago. Didn't matter the code you're under, you're gonna do it. So now the 2015 has changed that and said, you don't have a choice, you're gonna do it. 30 continental United States in the 200 mile plus wind zone. That's the dark orange part. I bring that up because FEMA says in the risk assessment that you have as much risk in the 200 mile an hour wind zone as you do the 250. Why they didn't include that in the code, I have no idea. I talked to some guys that were proponents of that code change. They said, well, we had to start somewhere. But if the risk assessment's the same, seems like it ought to be there, right? In my mind. Big area. Big area. So let's look at some perspectives. The owner's perspective, you know, they're looking at benefit cost. I hear this question all the time, is it worth it? Is it worth the money? Did you know that the FAA puts a price on your head when you step on an airplane? Each and every one of you? In 2011, that price was $6.9 million. That's what you're worth. Why did they use that? They use that to assess upgrades and safety on airplanes. So they have to put a value to that to see how much is going to be spent to upgrade the safety portions of an airplane, so they have to come up with a dollar value. How is that relevant? FEMA uses these exact numbers to do, as a part of their benefit cost analysis. When you do a shelter that's FEMA funded, they run it through this benefit cost analysis. They use that number by FAA. So, somebody says, is shelter worth it? Well, if I do a shelter for 600 people at $6.9 million a head, that's $4.14 billion worth of lives that we're trying to protect. If you spend on a masonry building, if you have a premium, roughly $500,000 to $1 million to make that masonry building into a shelter, it's a lot less than $4.1 billion, right? I mean, how do you argue that? It's pretty good value. Owners looking for funding availability, how do we pay for this thing? And again, FEMA has dollars out there once in a while, but there has to be a disaster that occurs. Doesn't necessarily have to be a tornado. It could be an ice storm, it could be an earthquake, it could be flooding. Monies become available, and you might be able to use that for shelters. But it's few and far between. Timing's usually not right. And then a dilemma of, well, especially in schools, you know, do we open this up for public use? That's a dangerous road to go down, quite honestly. Really dangerous. From a design professional's perspective, again, we're looking, you know, are the buildings that we're designing, if it's an addition or a new building, do I have space that's conducive to make into a shelter? Shelter benefit versus cost, that's what owners hire us for, right? Best bang for the buck. Project funding. Is that my phone? Okay, sorry. Project funding. Experience, and this bothers me. I've seen many architects never done a shelter, and that reflects the attitude that they have toward that shelter with the owner. I've seen architects that have talked owners out of doing shelters because they didn't know what they were doing. How sad is that? Had a perfect opportunity, had a client that was willing, but said, you know what, it's not worth it. And they listened. Don't let this happen. Code's helping that because it's not giving you a choice, not giving the owners a choice. But don't let that happen. From an end user's perspective, they believe in the duck theory. If it walks, quacks, and flies, and most importantly, if somebody says it is a duck, then it better be a duck. That's the most redneck slide I got right there. Well, maybe I have another one. It's not a duck. But when somebody says, hey, this is a duck, you know, they believe it. They don't have time to go and research. That wasn't a duck. That was a designated tornado shelter in that school. It's not a duck. Another designated tornado shelter in a school. And that's not a duck. That's my other redneck slide right there. I just don't, you know, it's hard to even come up with something to say about that one. Again, end users are dependent on owners and dependent on you as designers. If you're going to provide them a shelter, then it needs to be one. I don't care what you call it. These are signs, I find these at airports all the time. I think maybe that one's from O'Hare even. Not a one of those is a shelter. Notice this one, it's hard to read, but that says tornado shelter located in a meat cooler. That might be kind of ironic, huh? They're dependent. They're dependent. They don't have time to go check it out to make sure that this is what they need. So who's vulnerable? Well, if you're in tornado-prone areas, everybody is. That is ones that don't have shelters. The most vulnerable, those in a transient state. We're all in a transient state, unless you work here. And that's what I consider a transient state. And it's not going to happen today because it's 20-some degrees outside. But if there's a tornado coming down the road right now, everybody know where to go? That's the problem. That's the problem. Depending on the latitude, that could be, 11 o'clock in the morning till midnight from February to October, depending on where you're at in the country. And that's not absolute. A couple of years ago, my hometown, it's about 45 miles southwest of Wichita, December 13th, had a tornado. December 13th. Usually our tornado season ends 1st to mid-October. So it can happen, and it can happen anytime. Some people are going to argue that it's happening more and more, and it's moving more north and north. If you look at the tornadoes a couple of years ago, the tornado alley really wasn't from Wichita down to Oklahoma City. It ran across Nebraska, Iowa, and even into this state. So it varies. How many of you, setting aside your immediate family, because I assume most of you live here in Illinois, how many of you have family, friends that either live, work, or play within that 200-mile-an-hour wind or 250-mile-an-hour wind zone? Show of hands. So tornadoes can affect you. Maybe indirectly, but it can affect you. So looking at spaces that are conducive for shelter use, you're really looking for floor space, open floor space, space that you can easily move furniture, stackable type furniture, out of the way quickly. And when I say quickly, I'm within 5 minutes. So that's the ideal. Spaces that are closest to occupants that move the slowest. In schools, who moves the slowest? It's little dandelion pickers, right? The world's a whole new experience to them, and they're taking it all in. They're not worried about moving very quick. Versus a junior in high school, it may be on the football team that can move pretty darn quick. So those people that move slow, you'd like to have that shelter a little bit closer to them. Spaces that already have restrooms associated with them, you got to put restrooms in community shelters. Why build something that doesn't have a toilet, and now I got to add toilets to that to boot? It just adds to your cost. And spaces with minimal openings. Openings are difficult to deal with tornado shelters. It's pretty easy to build a solid wall that can resist at least the debris. That can resist the wind too. But as soon as you start punching openings in it, that's where some of the complexities come in. And it's costly. You talk about a tornado door and frame, we budget about $5,000 a leaf. So it's costly. But that's installed, that's hardware, that's everything. And that's a system. We'll get into that here in a minute. Some good examples, multi-purpose spaces. Without barring the windows, a space like this might be pretty good. Classrooms, kindergarten rooms work really well in schools. Music rooms work really well because they're usually pretty wide open. Art rooms, media centers, break rooms in buildings, conference and training rooms, locker rooms, weight room or wrestling rooms, locker rooms and wrestling rooms, because are typically already built hell for stout in a school. So those work well. Not so good, corridors that are just the corridor. Why? What room in a building probably has the most openings in it, door openings in it? It's a corridor, right? Too many openings. Storage room, too much stuff. Put storage on the name of a room, and what happens? Especially in schools, they fill up about that quick. And now you've used up the floor space that you need, right? So don't even go there. I tell people, you know, storage rooms are off limits. We went to North High School in Wichita to look at their tornado shelter. It was in the gym underneath concrete bleachers. Went and opened up the pair of doors, and literally, balls and stuff come rolling out. And I asked the principal, I said, and this is your shelter? She goes, yeah. I said, well, what do you do with all this stuff? She goes, well, we pull all that out into the gym, and then we let the kids in there. You got 5 minutes. Take them about 10 minutes to pull the stuff out. So storage rooms don't work. Mechanical, electrical equipment rooms, there's just too much stuff in there that you don't want people leaning against, touching, and getting hurt that way. Restrooms aren't good because they're just stuff that's taking up floor space, right? And this is a common deal. People want to put people in toilets. You know, it's not very sanitary to walk in and sit down on the floor of a public restroom. I don't want to do it. Science labs in schools don't work very well. I've done one. There's just too many openings. Just way too many openings. You know, you get the pickled critter cabinets that you got to exhaust and all that stuff, and there's just too many openings to deal with. Not that you can't do any of those. No, don't get me wrong. Not that you can't. They're just probably not the best places to put them. Basements aren't so good. Basements. How many of you heard that? Oh, you got to be underground. Oh my God, you got to be underground. You know, there's a TV reporter when there's a tornado in Oklahoma City that said, if you can't get underground, you're going to die, so go somewhere else. 11 people died on the highways because they listened to the guy. That's bad. So you don't have to be in a basement. You got to get them ADA accessible. And the big thing, you know, the two big things, how do you get people out after the fact? You know, I tell you, stairwells drift full just like snow, except it's full of debris. It's very difficult to deal with. So evacuation becomes a problem. And then water intrusion. I was telling Kevin last night about 5 shelters in Sedalia, Missouri that were FEMA funded, underground shelters. They were poured in place concrete. They stuck up out of the ground about 3 feet, had a concrete top on it, but no roof membrane. Because they wanted to leave it open in case they wanted to build something on top of it or something like that. The structural engineer didn't account for deflection of the joists that they used, which I never recommend using bar joists in a tornado shelter because they are a gravity system and you're dealing with uplift, big uplift. But they didn't account for the roll as these bar joists deflected, the ends of the joist rolled ever so slightly and cracked that concrete all the way around about 4 inches back from the face, and put about a 1/2 inch crack all the way around. Let so much water in. They closed them. As soon as they were open, they closed them. Wow. About 8 months later, they rectified the problem. Should have never been a problem. But they literally just had water pouring down the walls, 2 feet of water in the shelter. People aren't going to go down there. You know, there's 6 inches of water. They're not going to go down there. Stair enclosures. You know, sometimes stair enclosures are built hell for stout because of fire. They don't work very well, though. Doors are swinging the wrong way. We're going to talk about that in a minute. You don't have restrooms available in there, right? And the higher you go, the stronger the wind gets. You have to account for that. Not so good separate buildings. To go out and put a tornado shelter separate from the host building, that can be a problem. There's a study done back in 2000, studied roof ballast. Typical 1.5 inch, 3/4 inch river rock that you may see on a roof. At 87 and 62 mile an hour, they started to move, started to roll. Then they found out at 96 and 69 miles an hour, they become missiles. They actually took flight. Well below 250 mile an hour, right? You can easily have 100 mile an hour inflow winds into a tornado. Tornado is nothing but a cylinder that is of extreme low pressure, and the reason it's low pressure is that air inside of a tornado is going straight up. So it's sucking in air to replace that, only to go right out the top of it. Those can easily be 100 mile an hour before the tornado even gets there. And the bigger the tornado, the bigger the radius of those inflow winds are. And a lot of times the stronger they are. So well before the tornado gets there, you can be dealing with those type of winds. Also, at least around in our neck of the woods, we have some of that small hail, and we have torrential rains associated with that. Now you're asking people to leave the host building, go outside and deal with that small hail, literally, that small hail to get to the tornado shelter. I tell you, I got kindergartners that'll say, I'm not going out there. It's human nature. Look outside and it's dropping, baseball-sized hail. You're not going to go out there. So that becomes a problem. Some examples. These are all associated with schools. They all are masonry. Our philosophy with designing shelters in schools, especially for you school designers, is we're designing educational spaces that serve as shelters, not shelters that serve as educational spaces. Everybody has this lock that we got to put in this concrete box that's this dark and gray and really dingy space. Doesn't have to be that. You're going to use it for something else a lot more than you're going to use it as a shelter. Louis Kahn once said, tornado shelters want to be something else. This is a kindergarten wing, includes the corridor, not the corridor by itself, but 3 classrooms. That's about the size for 750 occupants. This is a tornado shelter addition. This is the existing building from here over. We put in what we like to call an umbilical cord, and then this is actually the shelter. Matched the building that was there. And that was the goal. Doesn't have to look like a big concrete box. That's the inside of that shelter. Does that look like a shelter? It doesn't. You're going to use it for a school. A lot more than a shelter. There's the inside of one of the classrooms. Anybody see what the giveaway is that this is a shelter? Shutter. What is it? Shutter. That's right. This is a 8x8 opening, and that's a shutter, and that's a shutter. It's probably one of the least expensive ways to protect windows. There's other ways to protect windows, but they're expensive. Oops, sorry. Wrestling room. Band room. Band room works really nice because you get the benefit of the sound. How do you reflect sound? How do you control sound? With mass, right? You're going to have a lot of mass, believe me. Works good in elementary school, especially when they're beating on the 3-pound coffee cans and all that stuff that drives some people nuts. Here's some examples. Connection between foundation and a masonry wall. This is difficult because you have to hit as they're laying out. You don't wait and lay out masonry after the floor slab's put in. Those bars have to hit the cores. No bending, None of that stuff. They got to be right on the money. Your mason needs to be out there when they're putting in the foundations. Make them aware of that. This isn't a do-over. Masonry wall fully reinforced, 2 number 5s in every cell, 12-inch block. They're hell for stout. Connection between the roof and the wall. Composite roof deck, fully reinforced. Breakaway connection. And we'll talk about this here in a minute, but prefer not to hang stuff off your shelter. The code wants you to separate the shelter completely from the host building. So that way, as the host building goes away, it doesn't put any additional force on your shelter. If you have to do it, you need to create a breakaway connection, which basically is the ultimate design on this connection between the beams is one heck of a lot less than the design connection between that beam and that wall. So this connection is going to fail far before or long before this connection is going to fail. Now there's a real problem with this detail. Wasn't one of mine. Anybody see what the problem is? How do you reinforce that as a detail? How do you reinforce that concrete brick that filled in the pocket for the beam? You can't. Can't do it effectively. So what happens, a missile hits this, knocks it into the shelter, that's a problem. Way to fix that, you can put beam pockets in all day long, either on the interior or the exterior. If the beam's flush with the outside of the wall, you put a plate over the end of that, 1/4-inch plate, weld it to the beam, make sure it sets tight against the wall. You can do that on the inside too, or the inside, don't have to do both. That's the way to fix that. Forget non-reinforced stuff. Has to be reinforced. Every bit of it. I'm sorry? You could. We've seen guys that will actually hold the beam back and let that deck come over and fill that pocket with concrete. Again, it's got to be reinforced though. You got to make sure that happens. Structurally, what we see though is most structural engineers want full bearing on those beams. Full bearing. So that becomes a problem with that detail. Here's the opening protections on the roof. These are called shrouds. They're kind of hard to see with the lights, but this is a rooftop unit. You can see there's the supply air and return air. It's an L-shaped. You're basically wanting to cut off the missile trajectory coming through that roof opening. Rooftop unit's going to be gone. Got a nice hole in the roof. Now you got potentials for missile coming in. You got to cut that trajectory off. You want to have debris hitting 2 reinforced surfaces before it comes into the occupied portion of the shelter.
What is that? Is that heavy steel or it's not just sheet?
No, this is actually 1/4-inch plate, welded, hell for stout. This is a roof drain. I don't recommend doing roof drains. Again, it's just another opening you got to deal with, and these aren't cheap. Rooftop unit there. You can see beams, bridging becomes a big issue with tornado shelters on the roof. Pay attention to that. Composite deck, steel beams. I think those were W30s on that particular job. So why is masonry a viable option? Concrete's option, precast, cast in place. Some cases wood may be an option. We're actually consulting with a firm that's building small wood shelters. But why masonry? In my opinion, it's readily available. You know, you're not somewhere out in the boonies and you got to haul precast somewhere. It's inherent strength and durability. Fire resistance. Tornado shelter has to be separated from the host building by 2-hour fire. This is the part that I like the best, is I'm dealing with an 8-inch module, not an 8-foot module, as in precast. It's good in both large and small shelters. Sound control, as we talked. Leaves an interior finish. You don't have to fur it out. You don't have to do anything like that. And the trust and strength by the public. I've talked to several people that build a house and you say, did you put a tornado shelter in? Oh no, I got brick on the outside of my house. Well, that doesn't do you much good. But the point is that they have that mindset that it's masonry, it's going to keep me safe. And that's really important. Any questions thus far? Yes?
Is there a standard missile schedule now that's been codified, or
As far as
just
what?
you need a design for?
Yeah, the standard, the protocol for tornado shelters is a 15-pound 2x4 at 100 miles an hour. That's code, that's in both the 361, that's kind of been the premise all along. So that is the missile. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I saw that kindergarten. Do you have a structure above that, reinforced composite steel classrooms above that? You could just make a shelter on the first floor?
You could, but again, what the problem is in 2-story shelters, especially when you do, well, in either case.
That above would be another use, but you have.
Right. If you do a shelter that's first floor with a non-shelter above it, the problem that you have is separating, as I said earlier, separating between the upper floor and the shelter itself. You don't want that undue pressure. You know, when that second floor goes away, you don't want one of those walls trying to hold on to that shelter and all of a sudden it rips the connection between your shelter roof and your shelter wall apart. I've seen it done. They put an exoskeleton on the outside of the shelter to support the floor and the roof above. It's expensive. So yeah, it's a problem. I've seen 2-story shelters that the whole thing was a shelter, which is pretty effective. But when you go and start adding stuff on top, that's a big problem. Yes?
Question on the exterior walls, obviously for shelter masonry, for running conduits and, you know, having anything within the fully guarded walls besides the construction sequence, is that fully out, or should we consider?
Within, like running conduit within the wall, that typically isn't a problem. It's when you're punching clear through the wall or the roof that's a problem. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. So some do's and don'ts. Sorry, it's going nuts. You need to understand that public perception. You got to understand that. Don't give these people a chicken. They're expecting a duck. You need to understand wind events. This isn't about designing this thing that is only important during the event. It goes well beyond that, and you as designers have to understand that. If you don't understand what's happening before the event, how am I getting people there? How do I get them there effectively? What do I do when I get them in the shelter? You know, who's controlling the doors, who's controlling the ventilation system, who's locking the doors, all that stuff, you got to understand it so you can pass that on to your client. You know, you design a shelter, this isn't just walking away. But all that can affect, without knowing that, can affect, you know, where you place a shelter. Are you doing it right? You doing it wrong? We'll see some examples of somebody doing it wrong. And there's post-event. Tornado's gone by, it's hit this tornado shelter, everybody's fine. Now what? What are the complexities of getting people out of there? What are the complexities of if somebody's hurt inside the shelter and I can't get them out? All that stuff is important. And it's important as designers for you to understand top to bottom, not just the event. And you got to understand the magnitude of what we're talking about here. 250 mile an hour wind, the pressures are incredible. On a 3070 door, it's 2.5 tons of pressure on that door. On a 10 by 10 wall, it's about 13 tons of pressure. That's just the wind pressure. That's not taking debris into account. That is just the wind pressure. It's incredible. Here's a pair of doors that went through a tornado. Non-shelter doors. Those are outswinging doors. Outswinging hollow metal doors. Try that sometime. Don't let anybody see you, but try it sometime. Those are 18-inch deep double T's, about 45 foot span. They're 100 feet from where they started. There's a soccer mom having a bad day. That's a metal building having a bad day. Portal frame, couple frames. Need to understand management issues with tornado shelters. Don't design them and walk away. Now they got to be managed. If your owner doesn't understand what you've designed and how you have designed it to work, if you don't pass that information on, that's a problem. How do they know? You got to convey that. You got to let them know. But you got to understand it. Here's an example of 6 tornado shelters in Kansas, in a school district in Kansas, that they got these shelters done, and the owner says, hey, we're going to open this up to the public. Well, the red flags start off on the first couple words. First of all, FEMA doesn't approve anything. They don't approve products, they don't approve design, they don't approve anything. If you ever see a product that says FEMA approved, that should throw up a red flag immediately. Immediately. There's a good friend of mine that works for Region 7. He would go through the internet just searching for doors and windows and any product that people are putting out there, looking for the term FEMA approved. And he told him, you better change it, because they don't approve anything. So that ought to be a flag right off the bat. In this case, it was a flag to me. You got 6 shelters, and it says basically that they got some volunteers that are local to the shelter. Shelter hosts, as they are able, will report to the shelter and open it up when the siren sounds. Anybody see problems with that? Those are major problems. First of all, what if they don't show up? Because it says the district cannot guarantee that the shelters will be open. If time does not allow for the shelter hosts to get to the shelters safely, the shelter hosts, which may be 1 or 2 people, they might not get them open. So you have a couple of 100 people show up at the shelter, sitting there going, well, are they going to open this shelter or not? So now they've exposed themselves to the storm, getting to the shelter. They're exposing themselves, watching their watch, going, is anybody going to show up? Oh, nobody shows up, so now I got to expose myself again to go somewhere else. Time's up. That's a problem. That is a huge problem, and people are going to die because of that. Got to make sure that your clients understand if they're going to open them up to the public, and I am not a proponent of that whatsoever. But there are people in this country writing codes that believe that, if taxpayers pay for a school, then they ought to be able to use a shelter. Well, somewhere along the line, I help pay for the White House, but that doesn't allow me to go use it whenever I want to, right?